Suffering, to the unexamined mind, appears as an enemy, something to be eradicated, avoided, or denied. But to the awakened soul, suffering is not merely an affliction, it is a message from the depths, a call from the unconscious asking to be heard. Most people spend their lives running from pain, distracting themselves, numbing themselves, pretending it does not exist. Yet in this running, they magnify their torment, for what is suppressed does not vanish, it festers, it distorts, it grows in the shadows. Carl Jung taught that the path to liberation is not to flee from suffering, but to turn toward it with a courageous and honest gaze. This is not a sentimental embrace of pain for its own sake, but a recognition that suffering holds the keys to our transformation. The wound, Jung reminded us, is the place where the light enters. When we suffer, it is often because there is a fracture between who we are on the surface and who we are in the depths. The persona, the mask we present to the world, does not align with the truth of the soul. This misalignment creates tension, and that tension manifests as emotional pain, confusion, and despair. The cure, then, is not to polish the mask, but to dissolve it. In the act of self-confrontation, we begin to integrate the shadow, the neglected, rejected parts of ourselves that hold both our fears and our untapped vitality. Once we stop resisting what we feel, once we let the unconscious speak, suffering loses its teeth. It ceases to be a tyrant and becomes a teacher. To never suffer again is not to live without pain. Pain is inevitable, but to end the inner resistance that turns pain into suffering. When you accept what is, when you listen to what the discomfort is pointing toward, you strip it of its power to dominate you. Life will still bring its storms, but you will no longer drown in them. Instead, you will navigate them as part of the great journey of individuation, the process of becoming whole. The paradox is simple yet profound. The moment you stop trying to escape suffering is the moment you transcend it. In embracing it, you rob it of the very fuel it feeds on: your fear, your avoidance, your denial. 3 minutes may be all it takes to shift the way you see suffering forever. For in that brief time you can be introduced to a truth most people never grasp in a lifetime. Suffering is not the end of the road, it is the door. And once you walk through it, you discover not more pain, but the vast, unshakable freedom of a soul that has made peace with itself. Suffering, when seen through the lens of the unconscious, becomes something far deeper than an obstacle to be avoided. It becomes a message encoded in the language of the soul. Most people are conditioned to perceive suffering as an external enemy, an unfortunate disruption to the smooth flow of life. They see it as an intrusion, something to be eradicated with distractions, substances, or shallow affirmations. But in reality, suffering is the psyche's way of drawing your attention to a truth you have ignored for too long. It is the unconscious mind speaking to you in a voice that cannot be silenced by reason or routine. When you hurt, it is often because some part of you has been abandoned. Some truth about who you are, what you feel, or what you need has been pushed out of awareness, and now it demands to be heard. Like a fever in the body that signals an underlying infection, suffering is the soul's fever, a sign that something within is out of balance and must be confronted. Yet instead of listening, most people wage war against their own pain. They distract themselves with constant activity, chase pleasures to numb the ache, or convince themselves that it will go away if ignored long enough. But suppression is a dangerous game, for what is buried does not die. It gathers strength in the shadows, shaping your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways you cannot control. Jung understood that the unconscious is not a passive storehouse of memories. It is alive, intelligent, and purposeful. It sends suffering not to punish you, but to awaken you. The reason you cannot simply will suffering away is because it is not a flaw in the system. It is part of the system, a built-in mechanism designed to bring your conscious attention to what you have refused to face. When you start to see suffering in this light, you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" That shift alone can dismantle much of the anguish you feel, because now, instead of being the helpless victim of your pain, you become its interpreter, its student. And the moment you stop resisting the message, the suffering often begins to lose its intensity. You start to realize that the enemy was never the pain itself, but your relationship to it. Pain says, "Look here." Your suffering comes from looking everywhere else. When you finally meet it eye to eye, you find that the darkness it seemed to hold is not a void, but a doorway, one that leads to a deeper understanding of yourself than comfort could ever provide. In this way, suffering is not your enemy at all. It is your most persistent, unrelenting ally in the lifelong journey toward becoming whole. The refusal to face the shadow is the root of most human suffering, for what is hidden in the depths of the psyche does not lose its power simply because we pretend it isn't there. The shadow, as Jung described, contains all the impulses, desires, and truths we have rejected because they do not align with the image we want to present to the world. We exile these parts of ourselves into the unconscious, thinking we have escaped them, but in reality, they follow us like an invisible companion, shaping our choices, our relationships, and even our sense of self. The more we suppress the shadow, the more it seeks expression in ways we cannot control, through irrational anger, self-sabotage, envy, resentment, or unhealthy attachments. Many live their entire lives running from these disowned parts of themselves, terrified of what they might discover if they looked too closely. But the paradox is that this avoidance only tightens the grip of the shadow. You cannot defeat what you refuse to face, and you cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. True liberation begins when you turn toward the shadow, when you summon the courage to see yourself without filters, without excuses, without the armor of denial. This confrontation is not comfortable. It will strip away illusions, challenge your self-image, and reveal truths that may feel unbearable at first. Yet it is precisely this process that dissolves the hidden chains binding you. Because the shadow is not made up solely of what is bad or dark in you. It also holds your neglected strengths, your suppressed creativity, your unclaimed power. It contains the raw, unpolished essence of who you are, untouched by the conditioning of the world. By integrating the shadow, you cease being at war with yourself. You no longer waste energy repressing what is within, and instead, you harness it consciously. This is why Jung insisted that wholeness, not perfection, is the true goal of human development. Perfection is a mask. Wholeness is the union of all that you are, the light and the dark, the noble and the flawed. To face your shadow is to reclaim the lost fragments of your being, to become someone who moves through life with the quiet strength of self-knowledge. And in that integration, suffering begins to lose its sting, for you are no longer a divided self battling unseen enemies. You are one complete force, standing fully in the truth of your own existence. Attachment to illusions is one of the subtlest yet most destructive sources of human suffering, for we are not only attached to people or things, we are deeply attached to the stories we tell ourselves about life. These illusions can take many forms. The belief that the world is fair and will reward us for our efforts, the fantasy that certain people will never betray us, the conviction that if we just follow the right path, everything will go smoothly. Such beliefs may comfort us temporarily, but when reality inevitably contradicts them, we are thrown into despair. The human mind resists this confrontation, clinging tighter to the illusion even as it cracks, because letting go feels like losing a part of ourselves. Yet this very clinging is what prolongs our suffering. We do not suffer because reality is cruel. We suffer because we demand that it match our fantasies. Jung understood that illusions act as a protective veil, shielding us from the raw and often unpredictable nature of life. But he also knew that this protection comes at a price, the price of living inauthentically. When you are bound to illusions, you cannot see clearly, and without clarity, you cannot make decisions rooted in truth. Liberation begins when you dare to pierce the veil, to examine the beliefs you have accepted without question, and to ask yourself whether they are aligned with reality or merely with your wishes. This process is not easy. It requires the death of certain comforting narratives, the acceptance that not all people will act honorably, that not all efforts will be rewarded, and that control over life is far more limited than we would like to believe. But in this death of illusions, a greater freedom emerges, the freedom to respond to life as it is, not as we wish it to be. Paradoxically, when we stop demanding that life conform to our expectations, we begin to suffer less, because we are no longer in constant friction with reality. We learn to adapt, to see opportunities even in loss, to recognize that the collapse of an illusion is not the end, but the beginning of a deeper, more grounded way of living. In letting go of illusions, we are not becoming cold or cynical. Rather, we are making space for truths that can sustain us in both joy and hardship. And in that space, life, though uncertain and imperfect, becomes far less capable of breaking us, because we have ceased to build our foundations on dreams that were never meant to hold our weight. The refusal to accept impermanence is one of the most common ways we invite unnecessary suffering into our lives. We live as if the people we love, the situations we enjoy, and even our own abilities will remain the same forever, despite knowing deep down that nothing in existence is fixed. We build our happiness on the fragile assumption of permanence, and when change inevitably arrives, through loss, aging, betrayal, or the natural shifting of circumstances, we are shattered, not because the change itself is unbearable, but because we were unprepared to face it. Jung understood that the human psyche clings to stability because change threatens our sense of control. The ego seeks to create a world where nothing disrupts its order, where what we cherish today will remain untouched tomorrow. Yet this desire collides directly with the reality of life, which is a constant process of transformation. Resisting this truth drains us, for it keeps us in a state of perpetual tension with the natural flow of existence. When we resist impermanence, we do not preserve our joy. We poison it because every moment is overshadowed by the fear of its ending. Liberation begins when we stop fighting the inevitability of change and instead learn to move with it. To accept impermanence is not to become detached in a cold, lifeless way. It is to become deeply present, savoring what is here without the illusion that it can be held forever. The flower is beautiful precisely because it will wither, the conversation precious because it will end, the life valuable because it will one day be gone. This awareness transforms how we engage with the world. Instead of grasping desperately, we appreciate fully. Instead of mourning the passing of each phase, we recognize it as part of the endless rhythm of growth and renewal. Jung would say that to embrace impermanence is to step out of the ego's fearful grip and into the deeper wisdom of the self, a part of us that understands life not as a static possession, but as an unfolding journey. When you live from this place, change ceases to feel like an enemy. Loss is still painful, but it no longer feels like the destruction of your world, because you have already made peace with the fact that nothing is truly yours to keep. And in that acceptance, suffering loosens its hold, for you no longer demand eternity from what was only ever meant to be a moment. Living out of alignment with your authentic self is a slow form of spiritual erosion, a way of dying without ever being buried. Many people spend their entire lives trying to become what others expect of them, tailoring their words, actions, and even their desires to fit into molds designed by family, culture, or society. At first, this adaptation may seem harmless, even necessary. After all, fitting in can bring temporary security, approval, and a sense of belonging. But over time, the cost becomes unbearable. You begin to feel an inner emptiness, a subtle disconnection from life, as if you are performing a role rather than living a reality. Jung recognized this as one of the deepest sources of psychological suffering, the gap between the persona, the mask we show to the world, and the self, the true, unfiltered essence of who we are. The wider this gap becomes, the more energy we must spend maintaining the illusion, and the less we have for genuine living. This misalignment creates a quiet despair, for even achievements and pleasures lose their taste when they do not reflect your real values or nature. To live authentically is not to rebel blindly against all external expectations, but to make every choice from a place of inner truth, even if it risks misunderstanding or rejection. It requires a courageous confrontation with the question, "What do I truly want?" A question many avoid because the answer often threatens the stability of the life they have built. But without that confrontation, you become a stranger in your own existence, living a script written by someone else. Jung would argue that the path to wholeness demands peeling away the layers of borrowed identities, letting die the false selves you have carried, and enduring the temporary chaos that comes when you stop performing and start being. This is not a one-time act, but a continuous process of self-examination and realignment, for the pressures to conform never entirely vanish. Yet each step toward authenticity reduces suffering, because you no longer live in the exhausting tension between your inner world and your outer life. Instead of seeking constant validation from others, you draw your strength from the quiet certainty of living in truth. And while the world may not always reward this choice, the deep peace that comes from being fully yourself is worth more than any applause, for it is the kind of peace that no one can give you, and no one can take away. One of the most potent causes of human suffering is the refusal to confront the shadow, the hidden, often denied aspects of ourselves that contain impulses, fears, and desires we find unacceptable. Most people spend their lives avoiding this confrontation, projecting their darkness onto others, judging in the outside world what they cannot bear to acknowledge within. This avoidance may offer temporary comfort, but it also robs us of wholeness, for the parts of ourselves we reject do not disappear. They simply work against us from the depths of the unconscious. Jung saw the shadow not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a source of untapped energy and wisdom waiting to be integrated. Yet this integration demands brutal honesty and the courage to face what we would rather hide. The shadow is not only composed of cruelty, greed, or envy. It also holds our neglected strengths, passions, and truths that were suppressed to please others or fit into societal norms. Denying the shadow keeps us fragmented, constantly fighting with ourselves, unable to understand why we feel so conflicted. But when we turn inward and begin the work of meeting these disowned parts without condemnation, something transformative happens. We stop being at war with ourselves. This process is rarely pleasant. It requires moments of humility, the willingness to admit that we are not as pure or consistent as we wish to appear, and the endurance to sit with discomfort without fleeing. But the reward is profound freedom. By accepting the shadow, you reclaim control over what once controlled you. The unconscious stops sabotaging you because it no longer needs to force its way into your awareness. You have welcomed it. Jung would insist that real strength is not in pretending to be flawless, but in becoming so whole that nothing within you must be feared or hidden. And when you live in this state, much of life's suffering dissolves, for the battles you once fought inside yourself are replaced by a deep, unshakable unity. From that place, you can face the world with a steadiness that cannot be faked, because you have already faced the darkest corners of your own soul and survived. Suffering often deepens when we cling to control, when we demand that life obey our plans and expectations, as if the world were obligated to move in perfect harmony with our desires. This compulsion to control is rooted in fear, the fear of chaos, loss, and uncertainty. But the harder we grip, the more life slips through our fingers, for existence is inherently unpredictable. Jung understood that much of human misery comes not from what happens to us, but from our resistance to it. When we insist that reality conform to our will, every deviation becomes a personal assault, every change a source of anxiety. The truth is that life will always defy your full control, and the sooner you make peace with this, the freer you become. This does not mean surrendering to passivity or abandoning responsibility. It means shifting from a rigid stance to a flexible one, from resisting reality to moving with it. Think of a tree in the wind. The rigid branch snaps, the supple one bends and survives. The art is in knowing when to act and when to yield, when to shape circumstances and when to let them shape you. Paradoxically, letting go of absolute control often grants you more influence over your life, because you stop wasting energy fighting the inevitable and start directing it toward what you can actually change. This is not blind acceptance, but conscious cooperation with reality. Jung would say that the ego must loosen its grip, allowing the deeper self to guide us through uncertainty with trust rather than fear. When you stop demanding that life be safe, predictable, and neatly ordered, you discover that much of your suffering was self-created, born from the impossible task of making a wild, living world fit into a narrow human plan. In embracing the unpredictable, you not only suffer less, you live more fully, for the energy once spent resisting is now available for experiencing, learning, and growing. And in that openness, life ceases to be an enemy to control and becomes a mystery to engage with, one that, while never entirely tamed, can still be profoundly beautiful.